Y bienvenidos a las...
Welcome to this sustainability seminar, ESG investment. We apologize for the delay. We were hoping to get you really keen, but apologies, and thank you for waiting. All I can tell you about this afternoon is that we're going to try and be punctual. We're going to try and give you an overview. We're going to analyze three perspectives of businesses, of regulators and investment, and of capital and investors. And before we begin in this forum organized by Red Eléctrica, I'd like to give the floor to Fátima Rojas, who's the Corporate Director for Sustainability and Research of the Red Eléctrica Group. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the sustainability sessions, which we're very happy to organize. It's one of the first events in which we actually have people in the room, and it's a pleasure to see people's faces again. As well as welcoming you, of course, I have to thank the third Vice President and Minister of Environmental Transition, who is joining us this afternoon to open these sessions, and to our President, Beatriz Corredor, who's the real promoter of this session and an ambassador of sustainability. I also want to thank all the speakers and participants for their prompt response to agreeing to discuss this very relevant topic with us. I also want to thank all the sustainability actors who supported us, Foretica was, and the Global Pact. Thank you also for the support we've received for the organization from the Advanced Leadership Foundation, EDT, all the technical people who are here making this possible, streaming all of this with simultaneous translation into English. And of course, thanks to all of you who've been kind enough to join us, as well as the almost 500 people who are following this online over the next 3 days. And these are days in which we will be speaking about ESG investment. And we've divided into 3 themes. Today is the governance day, and we're going to speak about finance and the importance of including ESG criteria in the management of companies. Companies need to be at the center of this change and want to be at the center of this change, and we have to be aligned with a purpose that will contribute to that just and inclusive social development that we all want. On day 2, we'll be speaking about the major environmental challenges, and climate change, of course, is the most relevant, as is biodiversity and all the aspects that have to do with the degradation of our oceans. To speak about the problems, but also to seek solutions and to share perspectives. And the last day, also extremely relevant, society, the social focus, because all of this transformation has to include everyone. We cannot leave anyone behind as defined by the 2030 agenda, and that must be the goal at all times. And companies also have an absolutely crucial role to play in that. And in Red Eléctrica, we want to be active in this whole transformation, not just because we integrate renewable energy sources and develop digital connectivity solutions, but also because we have a strong commitment which we would like to share. And according to the response we've had in organizing these sessions, we do think that there's a lot of interest, a lot of enthusiasm, and that these kinds of discussions can help us find solutions that will help us build this present and this sustainable, fair and inclusive green future we all want. Thank you very much for being here, and proceed. Thank you, and we're going to begin by listening, because of course what we have here on the table, all the elements I think are clear, and we've been talking about this over and over, but now we are already faced with this change of paradigm today, and we're seeing it in practice being deployed in Spain today, and that's what we're going to hear. And the numbers are overwhelming. There's 35 trillion in capital that are being invested for this, for the green transition, for all of these changes. And it's something that we have on the table right now, this whole change of paradigm in Spain about what the purpose of companies should be, and between stakeholders and shareholders, whether they should watch over their shareholders' interests or the whole of society. And of course, there's many elements there. There's the regulators, there's governments, there's investors themselves. So that's the perspectives that we will be exploring in turn, and the tensions between them, and how we need to proceed. And I'm sure that the Vice President of the government and Minister of Environmental Transition and Demographic Challenge knows a great deal about this. So we'll start by listening to her. A big round of applause for her.
Muy buenas tardes.
Well, good afternoon, Javier. Thank you very much for that introduction. Fatima, thanks for all the work that organizing something like this entails. Dear Chairman or Chairwoman of Red Eléctrica, Vice President of the CNMV, welcome all. I think in your introduction, you did touch upon all the elements in this debate and the balance that we need to achieve. Companies, of course, should focus on their shareholders' interests, but they also have a social role, and have to consider all stakeholders, all the people who will benefit from greater prosperity. And of course, the timelines are significant. The incentives to manufacture, to produce, to contribute are reasonably, I think, well defined, so that time will contribute to this transformation. Or are we just going to be focused on the short-term which is what sometimes happens with governments who always think of the next election, and we forget that quarterly reports are actually a lot shorter term than a government terms in office. And so I think this is an extremely crucial debate, more than ever, in this decade, which has begun so turbulently in March 2020 and then continued in January of 2021 with that record snowstorm, when we felt that there could be no more shocks and surprises in circumstances which, although unforeseen, were manageable. We did, I think, prove our ability to react collectively. I think the most important thing is to realize that the unexpected may happen at any moment, but that doesn't mean that we should not respond effectively and responsibly. All of us, each of us within our own scope and responsibilities, with our own remit and our ability to respond, from the public sector watching over the general interest, or also from the business perspective over the needs and interests of their shareholders and stakeholders. Since we're all people and we live together, and the collective well-being is also dependent on our individual response. And so in spite of the difficulties and the pain, our society has responded and realized that individual responsibility was also important for all. And we've seen it with those impressive vaccination rates. And so we are living at a difficult crossroads, and it's understandable that we are seeing an increasing interest in ESG aspects for all companies and organizations. We understand why ESG factors should be considered in the strategic decisions of any organization, but we also feel that it's important to learn by reporting, identifying, improving, seeing what the challenges are, the risks, which until now were not entirely visible. And over time, we've learned to identify and to quantify those risks, and to build a different future, to build a better future than probability alone would dictate. A future in which we would exceed the planet's capabilities, giving rise to tensions that could have tremendously painful social effect. And so with a roadmap that is full of challenges in a decade which has been very turbulent, very complex, in which we have learned to live with the consequences of a shared simultaneous global vulnerability, large scale, which has shocked us. We thought that things could be fixed with technology, but not everything can be fixed with science and technology, nor can everything be predicted, planned, or anticipated. But of course, the better we plan and anticipate, the more and better tools we have to respond, the lower the risks, and the more quickly we'll be able to respond properly. And that's, I think, a useful lesson, and it's part of this learning that we have been incorporating these last years when we spoke about ESG investment. So dear Beatriz, I think it's a great idea that you decided to organize these sessions in which there will be questions for everyone at this complex crossroads, as I said before, at a time when finally, and for different reasons, we have learned that we need to undergo a transformation towards a different future. But that means that practically everybody finally is going to be focusing our ability to transform, to recover, to grow in a different direction, which means that we must ask and demand from all the same thing at the same time and very quickly, which of course creates other tensions in a world with industrial and international relations, in logistics chains which were not really built for that. And so we are seeing different challenges and different tensions with these new questions, and a lot of the answers that we need to find, we have to find together, because we have learned that it's not just about setting targets. Setting targets is the first relevant step when we think about what we can expect from our term of government or our aims in a company. But it also matters how we achieve those different targets, which roadmaps we build in order to achieve those targets by whilst minimizing the risks, including the risks of new challenges and new concerns and new inequality gaps and new concerns developing amongst our stakeholders, whilst promoting equal opportunities and working so that everyone feels represented by these undertakings that we have shared, that we have defined together. And the other thing that we have learned during these years, but of course also before this terrible pandemic, but the pandemic has been reminding us of this fact, that environmental risks or social concerns, which until relatively recently were considered just a minor secondary element in the considerations of any responsible management group, have now become central elements and perhaps even the most important elements when appropriately weighing the responses that are needed if you want to succeed in achieving targets, in achieving your objectives in terms of financial success and stability in our undertakings. There are challenges that endanger all of these objectives, environmental components, concerns, or social demands that do compromise our development model and our security, and also influence business decisions, but also investment decisions. And I would say both public and private, both. And therefore, we see a context where there are interesting opportunities. It's different from what we might have envisioned 5 or 6 years ago, where responsible investment is going to be key, but we have to understand what we mean by responsible. We also see an acceleration in these processes and a growing demand from investors, from the general public, and that's a very interesting opportunity to transform our economic model, an opportunity which has materialized with some elements or contributions that were not even in our radar a few years ago. The transformation of our economic model is currently focused on what we identified in 2015 in Paris, considering those 3 elements of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social. And I do want to insist on the social cohesion components, because I think they're the most important. It's impossible to think of a far-reaching transformation like this one, which you may like better or worse, but we are involved already in this large-scale transformation. But it's impossible to succeed if you don't take into account the social dimension, the social element. And sometimes when we talk about social cohesion, we think about labor relations, about employees and workers, but actually there's lots of other important dimensions, including consumers and also citizens as voters or taxpayers or neighbors or people who will feel implicated in one way or another in the collective decision-making. And so you're organizing these sessions just days before COP26 begins in Glasgow. And it's interesting and striking that this is happening now in this context, because even though it might seem that it was almost 12 centuries ago, the actual last COP was held in Madrid just exactly 2 years ago, in a very different context indeed. It feels like it was centuries ago, and even several civilization cycles ago. And I think this has substantially altered the terms of this debate on public and corporate governance and the relations between public institutions and private actors. It's important to align citizens, governments, corporates. It's important to have a profound transformation, as I said earlier, and to seek a clear message which will promote socially responsible investment, which will truly define and approach things as an investment and not just as a cost, which may generate returns short term, but which will also be exhausted short term. And that's something that radically changes the way in which we think and plan and assess risks and value. And that changes to the extent that we cannot forget the most alarming messages we hear from scientists, as said by the Secretary General of the United Nations, in the sense that we are seeing a red light. And since we're running late, we either accelerate or we will have to deal with risks that will be very difficult to manage. There have been many other warnings that we have heard over the last few years, as well as many other statements about the opportunities if we build a different model in terms of generating prosperity and a more just future. And the first has to do with what we understand by value and cost in financial terms, but also in public accountability. And the second topic is also how we change the cultural pattern, the way in which we anticipate, assess, and promote preventive investment or risk reduction, something which is known in many investment or business spheres and in some of the traditional reporting frameworks, but which has been reinforced in these last few years. We know that in the context of insurance and reinsurance, this alarm went off when preparations were underway for the Paris summit in 2015, saying not only that not acting against climate change would mean a global impact on GDP, which was of almost 10% of global GDP by 2050, but also, and at the same time, that to invest early in order to build resilience and decrease vulnerabilities. And that's something that people who work in disaster preparedness understand well. Investing before the fact is absolutely crucial. And so you have to introduce this security variable also in the corporate and the business framework, something that was entirely different to what had been the norm for decades. Climate action, the incorporation of the value of the climate and ecosystems, and the value associated to loss of reputation, social recognition, loss of clients, and liability that would exist in case of lawsuits, or even the traditional substantive value, loss in value of the company or its assets, has become a credible, significant, and concerning reality. And at the same time, to invest differently by focusing on identifying those elements that will increase our safety, our security, thinking about aspects such as health, physical integrity, the value of biodiversity today and in the future, food security, prevention of conflicts and tensions, becoming central, not just for academics or for governments, but also for the World Economic Forum and so many other institutions that research and analyze global economic action, with an additional dimension, and that is what this means from the governance point of view, what it means in terms of anticipating potential bottlenecks if we all want or seek the same thing all at once, and what that will mean in terms of investing in alternative solutions that will mitigate the potential tensions or issues that might develop. And this is a debate that also arises when we ask the great question about what sort of recovery we want to see, what the Americans call Build Back Better. What does that mean in terms of policies for Europe, which had a rather interesting analysis already about how to build this great green pact. And it's interesting to see how these analyses always include the importance of recognizing assessing and valuing global risks appropriately. And secondly, the importance of anticipating the expected impacts to measure and understand what those impacts might be. But thirdly, and in my view, most importantly, we have the need to act thinking mostly about keeping people at the center, to know that if we provide responses for major crises, we must first think about the people. And that completely changes the approach that we had followed for decades. It's not just about thinking whether it makes sense from the point of view of the return on our investments. That's not enough. You have to think about the people and put society at the center. And the European Union has been following this approach. And of course, there's a great deal still to be done. But the EU feels that with the current crisis, we need to implement and accelerate a green social recovery to invest on what we need the most and what will generate the greatest return. Again, people, the prosperity of people, by properly measuring the limits to the capital we have, including natural capital, but also paying attention to the people at all times. And that is a radically different approach to the traditional approach which we had until not so long ago. In fact, in the previous financial crisis, which gave rise to much deeper problems of disaffection, loss of credibility of our democratic institutions, existential questions about how, when, and for what. We had an organizational model and social model, and people started questioning its limitations, something we cannot afford in a country where there's a growing number of people every year. And so the Green Deal is a strategy for progress, which requires, in order to succeed, that we consider the social sustainability component. And thinking about a Europe that could become the first climatically neutral or zero net emissions continent, and looking at the numbers, both locally but also globally, it's impossible to get it right, to succeed, if we don't take sufficiently into account the relevance which this significant, profound transformation could and would have on the people. And in Spain, I think that this is something that is pretty well established. There is a relevant level of awareness of the importance of putting people at the center. And increasingly, we remember this for different reasons, in different circumstances. We know that to think about transformation, including elements of territorial, social, environmental cohesion, is going to be essential. We know from experience what the consequences are of being a country where inequality and differences, unfortunately, increased during the years of the financial crisis. We know how important it is to have solid collective response mechanisms to cover people's needs. And this is acquiring increasing support and increasing visibility amongst each and every actor in our society. At the same time, we've identified some important variables in order to guide our economic decisions. In our own case, I'd like to pick up on some of the elements for strategic change that we've been promoted. The strategic framework for climate and energy, the circular economy strategy, but also in connection to that, we have the investment agenda in urban infrastructure. We have also the updated professional training system, which is what we need for science, for innovation. And we're also thinking of the modernization of the social benefits, the integration of people who come from third countries, and also financial and insurance advisory services, but also decisions connected to responsibility and full disclosure of both public and private accounts. And we know that this scenario has been reinforced by the recovery plan, the next generation funds of the EU, which have set clear criteria for this transformation strategy, and all of it at the center of the European construction process. But of course, then this needs to be applied in each country according to each country's priorities. In our case, with the Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan, whose main focus is to consolidating efficiency, and environmental security. 40% of the investments will be targeted at climate-related actions, green and the blue agendas, and together with that, a modernization that will enable us to be efficient, but also to redistribute wealth. And that contributes to social cohesion, as well as strengthening and updating some of the answers to the questions of governance, including digital transformation, intelligence, and the empowerment of people and institutions, culminating these themes with the belief that reducing inequalities also requires that we reduce the social and territorial differences. Perhaps one of the most unequal countries in terms of social cohesion in Europe, in terms of the availability of services in certain areas of our geography, the differences between the availability of services in our cities and in those rather empty rural areas, which we would like to see become a space offering answers to culminate the investments in infrastructures and transformation for its citizens.
Que creo se convertirá en muy poco tiempo.
I think this element will become in very shortly main access for private and both public and private investment. There's an obligation by the European Commission. It's the reporting obligation. You cannot invest just a single euro without justifying this actions in the plan do not harm significantly the environment. I have one person at the ministry's team saying, let's forget about Men in Black. What we have next is Men in Green. So we all need to learn how to manage in a more effective manner this precious green capital that we have in our environment. So we know that some of the elements in this agenda are key in this house with Miguel, Beatriz, Roberto. It's obvious that speaking about energy is essential. Capital energy, thinking about the services provided to citizens and the economy and the challenges that we have ahead of us. It is a reality that forces us to modernize the industry, employment, and to think about innovation, vocational training, and also to think about solutions, nature-based solutions that are compatible with our environmental priorities, integrated in the blue and green agendas with the social participation and involvement. That's the added element of governance. Everybody is involved. Everybody needs to be taking part in everything that will be changing, providing opportunities or challenges to the life of everyone. So I think that one of the ESG criteria that is highly valued in international markets, and we are increasingly accountable for those. It is and it's only natural, because if we do things right, everybody wins. If not, everybody loses. And this means a different way of understanding and tackling finances. We need to build our own plan for sustainable finance, and it includes the issuance of green bonds. The public treasury has already issued very successfully the first bonds, but there's also the other element, the compulsory reporting of risk assessment and diversification and mitigation of risks to comply with a certain roadmap to maintain a number of important milestones and benchmarks in all investment strategies. It is a paradigm shift, and it is tremendously interesting. We are learning it. We are in a learning curve, but we need to cover it fast, because very shortly, this learning will be taking us down the right path or not, and we need to be ready for that. And for that to be all ready, we need to reinforce dialogue among all stakeholders to improve trust of investors, of whole of society and businesses as well. sustainable management that needs to be fully aligned with something that was already present in the Paris Agreement. It's not just a significant figure, a percentage of investments in fighting against climate change. What we need to have is the overall of the financial flows is compatible with climatic security, and all financial investment flows need to be compatible with basic social protection criteria and protection of biodiversity. We've seen some recent steps lately in this national learning and in this European learning curve. There are still some elements to be tackled, but still we are reaching an agreement on what are our benchmarks, or common benchmarks, this debate on the green taxonomy, in order to harmonize the definitions and the language applied to ESG, trying to avoid and prevent this greenwashing and trying to disguise something as something that it is not, without a real serious spirit of change in the decisions that are either taken or reported. This will help us to reduce the fragmentation in markets and to minimize the variables that we need to be taken into account. We know that we will need to be mobilizing a high volume of resources. There are gaps to be filled. We know that the objectives regarding climate change, the use of the circular economy resources, this debate has just begun, but it has a full potential for mobilization of resources. We also know that there are some other parallel debates that are just arising now, such as trying to construct and to create an inclusive way of capitalism. What kind of market we have where the risks are always diversified and profit is only in the hands of a few. So there are the discussions to be had, but we need to do it fast, so we guarantee fairness in profit sharing. How can we step up and facilitate compatible ways of leaving one model that has been extremely effective, very solvent to take us here, but it starts to be ripping off at the seams and need to be quickly replaced with a different one. And the rhythms of demand and supply are still not aligned. How can we embrace dialogue, be it domestic, European, or global? We must always remember that to keep a focus in people, we need to mobilize all these resources globally, and in order to make the good decisions, we need a global consensus. Because if there's something that's important in my view, is that it's not enough to just have an idea, to have a goal. That's just the first step. But as Machado said, okay, you hit the ground running. You need to learn by doing, and this is what you are going to be focusing on in this next 3 days. Thank you.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you so much, Vice President, Deputy Prime Minister. So the loss of value, credibility, and reputation, that's important. That's just in order to discuss those with and to listen to businesses, and we will be listening to them right now. So there is a new change. There is a paradigm shift. We're hearing about a new capitalism, a new role for businesses and for investment as well. So we will be listening to business sector, that is Red Eléctrica, but we will, if we think of investment, BlackRock is not only business, it is also the dictate of what type of behavior, the performance needs to be followed, and with the charter that it's basically the preamble to Davis. So I'm going to invite them both to come over here and to start a dialogue on what's to come.
cifras son realmente abrumadoras.
So facts and figures, they are overwhelming. 35 trillion with T of sustainable investment worldwide. That is the overall picture. So it's been an extraordinary increase, almost 55% barely in the last 4 to 5 years. So there is a number of questions that I'd like to ask you from the viewpoint of business and investment. So, Chair of Red Eléctrica, Beatriz Corredor, she's here on behalf of Red Eléctrica, and then we have Aitor Jauregui, who's head of BlackRock Iberia. So let's begin. So this is going to be very lively. I'll try and surprise you as much as I can, but please, you know, cut each other off and start whenever you want to reply. So ESG, first of all, when this started, I mean, it's been 6 years since we have the SDGs and UN. The conclusion of the UN was this is going far too slow. But when this started, this was almost a wish list. And now how has this whole thing evolved in your company, in the business? Well, first of all, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Aitor. Thank you, Javier. Thank you to the museum, Reina Sofia Museum, and everybody who's made this conference possible, for those of you who are here in person and those who are here online. Well, why ESG? I mean, I know we both like to, discussions and debating and, okay, so this is the rift between business and investment. Okay, so we'll need to have, we have popcorn so we can enjoy the show. Well, everybody, all of those about this, they speak about megatrends. And if we think about megatrends, some of the issues have been generated by the pandemic. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. Now, everything that went down badly, that turned sour, well, it was, increasing poverty, increasing inequities, but there are other good things, such as digitalization, 5G, Internet of Things, remote or teleworking, robotization, AI. Of course, we have demographic challenges. I think that, very, very shortly, in 2 or 3 years' time, one of each per people will be over 50 and even over 80, some of us, and by then. So we also have more armed conflicts and very many trends that have been made more visible by the pandemic. So we now need to think going from what we used to call the corporate social responsibility, CSR, that I totally, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a bit of, taking the blame, and trying to return, to give back to society by doing some philanthropic things. But now things are different. The Vice President was discussing about the Paris Agreement, the new Green Deal, have focus on the E side, environmental issues, climate change, mitigation, reduction, and prevention, and also G, governance. How businesses need to be, focus on everyone and not only our shareholders, and then, transparency, reporting, what's accountability, but what's, being left behind is the S part. So the global reflection, both in the market, in society as a whole, that businesses is what exactly is business, the impact of businesses in their environment and the world that surrounds them. I mean, that's in our DNA. Of course, we have infrastructures everywhere all across the country. It has a social impact. It has corporate, good governance impact. We need to provide a public service because we are a utility, so we are the first electricity supplier, and we need to have social commitment because we have an impact on the territory. So to have the full circle, to go full circle is key for us. In social issues, we'd like to be trailblazing here as well. I'm fully in agreement with you. and thank you very much for inviting me here. We've made a lot of progress, and much more so, in corporate governance, because there has been a harmonization of taxonomy, mostly in environmental topics. So this is why we have common metrics and a consensus, many of them supported by technology, figures, facts, but also the accounting standards on sustainable SASB, TTCD, the working group on information about climate change. So all of that has made it possible to have a common framework. But is there a common framework, Aitor? Well, at least it's better than what we had before. I'm quite optimistic. I think that we are, we are going down the right path. I mean, we are. I mean, some little by little, some small steps. Okay, let me ask you both a question, because of course, we have the Larry Fink's letter. Okay, Larry Fink's letter, well, that, it's like a letter to Father Christmas. It arrives promptly every year. Okay, well, everything that you've been mentioning here, the social margin, the social, because you usually having, what you have in mind is the financial margin. No, social aspect is, but even if it's to the detriment of financial margins, well, not really. I mean, it's not necessarily so. What we saw with the pandemic. Okay, let me go back to the letters, the Larry Fink's letters, because I think Larry Fink's been, for 10 years already, has been speaking about issues that are essential for value generation and long-term capital management, importance of purpose. In 2020, 2021, he has been focusing a lot in climate change. So analyzing and studying the risks, but also historical investment opportunity that climate change means. So the first of his letters was in January 2020, related to climate change. Then just a few weeks later, then we were in the midst of a pandemic in a very complex situation. So this reallocation of capital that we are talking about, is it going to happen finally or not? Because the context has changed. Well, the transformation is already here to stay. It's been stepping up. It's speeding up, because we have seen this in flows, return and return on investment, even long term. So we are very, very attentive to all interest groups or stakeholders. You mentioned, stakeholders and corporate companies. So, of course, we need to pay a lot of attention to shareholders. That's absolutely true. But also our employees or suppliers or communities where we are operating, both local and global. So all of that is the social component, so the diversity in the company, in the board, that's also essential, and that is part of the social component in the company. But I mean, you are devoted to this, even if you are, having losses. I mean, P&L is something sacred. I mean, it's a holy grail. You need to give benefits, to profits to your shareholders. That is unquestionable. But it's not going to be in spite of that. I mean, it's not going to be to the detriment of that. I mean, the green transition is going to be profitable. I mean, that's Jeffrey Sachs said it. I mean, someone who comes from the U.S., to be doing that, like, the biodiversity, he's also speaking about that. So 80% of a company's value is its reputation, and reputation is not something that you can make overnight, artificially. I mean, it's perception, and what people think of you, and that's also valid for, not only valid for politicians, but also for businesses. Right now, I think Stetterman just said that, society, citizens, private citizens, have a greater trust in businesses than in governments. Because they see us as more effective. And now we're speaking about ethic capitalism, trying to apply it to the whole ecosystem. Even the European Central Bank is including climate climate criteria in its issuances of bonds, and also the Federal Reserve, the German central bank in Red Eléctrica, 45% is green bonds. 5% of our investment, whereas in Europe the average is around 30%. So it is a win-win commitment. Everybody is, I mean, this is becoming very profitable, but we are generating wealth for communities as well. So the perception of reality, that's what we journalists say, is actually the actual reality itself. And so I'd like to ask you, both of you, but all of this, even if it's perception-based, it all depends on metrics. Because you can say, okay, I'm number one, but then your competitors, your rivals will use just the most convenient metrics they can, so they can also say that they are number one. So what are, these metrics? What are the metrics to be used? And, and I'm asking both of you. So investment, with the different sustainability indexes that they have, I think I'm going to leave Aitor reply to this. Okay, the sustainability indices are, the ones that are helping us reallocate capital. Sustainable indexes, or indexes of sustainability, help us promote a diversification of investment, so there are more people who can have a greater exposure to different companies with different metrics, better ranked. Of course, I'm also very optimistic and positive about this. And I believe that this has been also part of this transition. And we are seeing how the situation is evolving with an increasing number of indexes everywhere in the market. So, everyone who is not covering sustainability or focusing on sustainability in their boards, they will be more skeptical. They will be having to face a greater skepticism from the markets, and they will incur in a greater capital cost at the end of the day. They will be having a harder time trying to attract solid and sound capital investments. And I love, capital skepticism. I really love that concept. Yes, this is going to be making capital more expensive in the end. Yes, green bonds. The green bonds, we had the lowest interest rate than we had at the time. And that is also confirming what Aitor said. But, speaking about the board and sustainability focus, etc., this is not something that is done just like that. I mean, this is something that is in the DNA of our company. It started much earlier than me. The sustainability committee was created in our company when it was not even compulsory to do that. I mean, this has been one of our fundamental criteria ever since, and we have the people here to prove it. And this is also streamlined through governance. We have a sustainability committee that sets the priorities and strategies, and we have this committee that is led by Fatima Rojas, who is chasing everyone in the company, same as if she was an auditor. She has thousands of indicators that everybody has to comply with, and so people need, all of investors know whether things we are doing things right. And also our retribution, remuneration of our top executives is also linked to these criteria. And we are given the non-financial information, same category of than we are going to give to to financial information. We have already adapted to the new green taxonomy from the European Commission. And we were not forced to do that. We did not have the obligation to do it yet. So I have the pleasure and the honor to be chairing one of the most advanced and progressive boards. And we are over 50% of women in our board. We have the sustainability, diversity, fairness, inclusion, harassment, and everything. It's to the top standards. We have committees for all that, and it's part of the culture, and that cannot be improvised. This cannot be done from overnight. Thank you.
Riesgos.
Aitor, when you take up risks, you incorporate the climate risk as an investment risk. So you're already discounting that in your calculations. Yes, absolutely. And to do that, we use technology in order to understand what the actual physical risk is derived from climate change, but also the transition risk towards a net zero emissions economy. And to do that, we're constantly investing in technology and proprietary systems, but we're also looking for partnerships with providers who can really help us analyze the risk of those companies we invest in. And what do you ask for? As Corridor was saying, our board of directors, what do you demand of the board of the companies you invest in? Well, the first we look at, and this is done by the BlackRock Investment Stewardship Group, what we do is to represent the clients, the investors who invest in BlackRock by having an active voice in those general shareholders meeting and in dialogue with the boards of the companies we invest in. And so the first thing we look at is we make sure that the directors are aware of the transformative role that they have in the company. And that's very much a long-term vision, and it has a lot to do with the purpose for the companies. Fatima was speaking about the importance of the purpose, as well as involving all stakeholders. So starting from that, we talk a lot in our engagement processes. We look at the diversity of those boards. And by diversity, I don't just mean gender diversity, although that's a factor, but also diversity of backgrounds, experience, ages, people that can really enrich the decision-making and who can, first, on the short term, watch over the P&L, but also longer term, focus on the long-term strategy, which in this particular case has, of course, a lot to do with climate change, the transition towards a net zero economy, making sure that that transition will be just and equitable, which is also something we could talk about. Let me know if I'm getting this right. You're not being manipulated by a journalist. So basically what you're saying is that you need to have parity, that if a board of directors has parity and is diverse, that has value. It means that you will lend capital to them more cheaply, or you'll be more willing to invest. So this actually has value? Yes, a board of directors that has diversity in the broadest sense. A board of directors that is able to make decisions on the sustainability of the supply chain of that company and the protection of client data, which is also such a pressing issue these days. When we talk about diversity, we are referring to a board that will be capable of taking decisions from a diverse perspective. And gender, of course, is extremely important and easy to measure, of course, speaking of metrics, but there are many other forms of diversity. Yes, as well as influencing the strategy, what a board has to do is to watch over change and anticipate change. And to do that, it must be able to have its attention deployed so that it can understand where things are going. And we now have a research department which provides us with advice, but also provides external advice so that we can anticipate changes and impacts, because a company that manages essential infrastructures all over the country must be very well informed of the potential impact of climate change. And so we invest a lot, as Aitor said, in cybersecurity, in both hardware and software. We have Spain's Grid Management Center, and that, which is the jewel of the crown of the whole system, has some of the highest standards of cybersecurity in the country. And obviously all of that means also that the company be aligned with that vision so that all of this can be deployed globally. That's why it's so important that the board's sustainability committee have the ability to anticipate developments and to hold the executives accountable through the various commissions and committees. And now that I've mentioned our executives, the board has the duty of making our executives uncomfortable. That is the duty of directors, to anticipate things that even the executives themselves, because of their focus on BAU, things that they might not see. And for us, the composition of the board is critical. And to have long-term vision in the strategy we've presented this year, we have it up to 2030, not just because the national plan runs to 2030, we've also extended that vision to 2050, because by 2050, both the long-term decarbonization strategy and the European requirements for emission reductions and to contain temperature rises runs to 2050, and so we've incorporated that time frame in our strategy, and that's something that a board needs to do. But let me answer. No, it's actually really important, because that's a task which goes beyond the head of sustainability. What we want to see also in the companies we invest in is that this be present at every decision-making level, and that the whole board should be able to understand what the impacts of climate change will be, and what the fiscal risk is, and transition risk, and so on. So it's not just the sustainability committees. Okay, and to close, I'm going to ask you both about the how you do it, how you define the purpose, how you carry out the change, how the board is structured so that that will happen. I'm going to ask you about the how, and how you combine economic growth with this transition, and how you see it. But first, let me play devil's advocate in all of this. Are we asking companies to do what governments should be doing? This idea of watching over the common good and not just their own profits, isn't that changeover in the roles? Because it's not about the company's profit, it's about the common good. That is a fact, and government and market are not incompatible. I once heard, I never forget, I never remember who said this, but it's a very famous quote. It says, as much market as possible and as much government as necessary. And that's the fact. They each have their role and their scope. But I think more than ever, as we have seen during the pandemic, we know that public-private partnership, not just corporates, all companies, also SMEs, and even professionals and self-employed have a role to play. Even as citizens, we each have our own scope. And I always say that sustainability is about leaving things better than you found them. And that can apply to our own private lives, to our professional life, our family, our businesses. If you leave things better than you found them, you're being sustainable. And so it's never incompatible. Quite the opposite. It's complementary. Plus, the challenge is so huge. The challenge we're facing is so huge that it's not something that can be done only by governments or only by businesses. Also, I think I could give you an example. Larry Fink last week published a letter, an article, again, in which he spoke about the need to mobilize capital or private investment in order to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in emerging markets. And just to give you a very tangible example, emerging markets are currently the biggest carbon emitters, 35% of the global emissions. And if we include China amongst emerging markets, which is a bit of a question mark, because capital markets are beginning to consider China as separate from emerging markets. But if we include China, we're talking about 65% of global emissions. In order to combat that problem and reach that net zero emission target, the annual investment that would be needed, the capital that would need to be mobilized, we think would be $1 trillion a year, which is a bit less than Spain's GDP. That is the capital that has to be mobilized. How much is being mobilized now? 150 billion. And so clearly we need 6 times that amount simply to reach net zero emissions. Can governments do that alone? No. Can the private sector do that alone? No. Within those organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, which through various programs and subsidies can promote having insurance companies, reinsurance. The Vice President was speaking about the insurance sector so that they can invest and flow and generate capital flows that will fund this transition. And I'm going to finish by asking you this, and in order to stay really punctual, I'll finish by asking you about the how. For you, for Red Eléctrica, view of all this, you define the purpose, you have that cultural change, but you have to measure it. How do you do that? How do you structure a board and everything you need in order to do all this? Well, the purpose, I always say, half jokingly, that business schools need to implement a new concept from ESG and value, mission, purpose. And it's what you're for, really. And we manage electricity and connectivity infrastructures, and we are a neutral grid, and so we don't have clients, we don't generate electricity, we don't sell electricity, we just transport it, and we provide connectivity, and we do that with a basic aim, which is to promote territorial and social cohesion. And that has to be the guiding element in your whole strategy. And in our strategy, we have actions that are measurable with metrics, which are in a business plan, which the market will monitor and decide whether we comply or not. And in that strategy, what connects all the company's policies is sustainability in this broader sense I've mentioned. And there are metrics, and they put you in these indexes, which are very demanding and change really fast. You can be pushed out of an index and have your spreads rise for an issue simply because you've had one accident which has caused certain emissions. And it's also very demanding in the day-to-day. And that has to be monitored by the board of directors. And we talk about purpose, but we can also talk about what leadership is, because you need leadership. It has to come from the top, but then it has to be implemented throughout the company, and people have to believe it. And I'll give you an example of what we're doing in Red Eléctrica. Red Eléctrica is an infrastructure administrator. And throughout the country, the public, general public, are increasingly aware of the impact on our environment, our landscape of infrastructures. And so we have to be able to operate responding to the needs of the communities and leaving things better than we found them. How do we do that? By changing the way our engineers operate. So first, we're not going to have the engineers go and design and plan the infrastructure. First, we're going to have the institutional relations people go and ask the community what they need. This is what we call the social operating license. And once we understand what the community needs, we will deploy the infrastructure, not vice versa, which is a complete change of approach. And it's hard to do, but the company is fully ready to take on this requirement, as we did with diversity, gender equality, and sustainability. And Aitor is saying, wow, that's a hard task. Well, what she's saying resonates absolutely, because it's the same for us. Exactly. Our purpose is very clear, and that is to help an increasing number of people to reach financial well-being. And that requires long-term investment, financial education. But what we believe, in line with what you were saying, is that there can be no long-term profit without a purpose. In fact, we believe that the purpose is really to be a catalyst of long-term profit, having a company and a business that is sustainable long-term. And how we do it is precisely by trying to understand whether the board or the management committee of a company is ready to take on those challenges, or able to take on those challenges, without, of course, being focused on its earnings, which is what will enable them to be sustainable long-term. I also want to mention the importance of teams and people. You have to be able to motivate, to increase awareness, to make sure people do what they have to do, but being truly conscious of the fact that that's what has to be done with the right level of self-esteem and motivation. That's the key in leadership, to have people do what they should do, but whilst feeling motivated and involved and engaged. Otherwise, if you don't promote talent and commitment, if you don't get them to believe what you're saying, it's impossible for the purpose to permeate the whole organization. So the corporate culture. Yes, well, Beatriz Corredor, chairman of the Red Eléctrica Group, and Aitor, head of business development at BlackRock Iberia. There were 2 minutes left, yes, but we were running 10 minutes behind. So thank you very much, both of you. It's been extremely interesting. Thank you.
Os dejo bajar y esta es la primera de las visiones.
I'll give you a minute to get down, and that was the first of our panels today, because we're going to hear 3 different takes on an extremely complex issue, as we've seen, and it has conflicting interests, because what we have is what we've just seen, and what we have is what we have just been discussing and arguing here. What should prevail, the social aim or the financial aim? And so we've heard the business perspective and the investment perspective, and now I'm going to welcome the people who are going to give us the second perspective, and who are going to take part in the second discussion, and whom we're going to introduce next.
Y vamos a hablar en...
Okay, so we're going to speak in the second panel about this, about monitoring non-financial performance. And as I've said, there's actually more power around this table than you might think. There's the National Stock Exchange Commission, the CNMV of Spain, the Bank of Spain, and the independent director from the Red Eléctrica Group. Let me introduce all three. Montserrat García, who's the vice president of the CNMV, Margarita Delgado, deputy governor of the Bank of Spain, and Carmen de Barreda, who's an independent director from the Red Eléctrica Group. I want to thank all three of you for being here, and I'm going to ask all three of you, and there's a lot of ground to cover, but here we have three of the most relevant institutions in this field, and we'll start with the CNMV. We have right now the SFDR, the national law, and we have this whole controversy we've just heard about whether the metrics are believable, whether they may be bought or not, whether they're real or not, whether you can become number one if you pay enough, and whether you can truly be sustainable or not. So the CNMV, first and foremost, what are the priorities in your agenda? Well, that was a lot of questions, Javier. That's the problem of having all of these experts. You're just tempted to ask a lot of questions. Right, well, that was a lot of questions, and I'd like to start by thanking Beatriz and the Red Eléctrica Group for inviting us to take part, and it's a pleasure to be here with the fellow panelists and with you, Javier. Thank you for the introduction. And so what elements should we consider from the supervisor's perspective? And I think it's come up in the previous discussions. The third vice president mentioned that we have to manage to integrate those risks, climate risks, social risks, ESG criteria. And to do that, we need data, we need information. That's what economic theory teaches us. We need the data, we need the information, and we need it to be reliable and of quality so that investors can consider the data to make their investment decisions. The problem is that it's not that simple. It's not that simple because, in fact, I was just saying that it's true that private initiative, and it was mentioned before, and there's been a lot of progress, and they have developed a lot of their own standards, but we don't yet have common global standards. And you spoke about the law 11/2018. That's the law that regulates the information that companies have to disclose. And I would say that the legislator and the government have been very ambitious because they have actually gone a bit beyond or have introduced elements which are currently under discussion at the European level. For example, with the law, in a few months, from January 1st next year, companies with over 250 employees will have to disclose a non-financial information report. That means tripling the number of companies that are required to produce a non-financial information report, a sustainability report, from 1,000 to almost 3,000. And in this whole ecosystem, the supervisors, in this case the CNMV, receives about 100 from listed companies. They are the ones who send us these non-financial information reports directly. And so that's a fact. That's just what's going to happen, and it will grow even more. But what are the challenges? What are we seeing in these reports, and why all these questions surrounding the information we receive? Because, as we've also heard before, the main issue that might arise, or the main risk that we have, is that we might have a lot of greenwashing, as we've heard, or the quality of the data might not be sufficiently reliable. And so, therefore, we might lose our ability to trust in the data and the information published by companies. And trust is everything for investors. You have to believe that the data that's being disclosed is real and accurate and so on. And that's the main challenge. And I have to say that, in general, our assessment of our companies is very positive, and we've seen significant progress and improvements in their reporting. But there are several elements that, if I may, very briefly, well, of course, but I'd like to remind rest of you, of course, that this is an open discussion, so you can jump in. If the Bank of Spain at any point feels the need to openly contradict the CNMV, go ahead and do it. And we've brought popcorn to watch. Well, I'm sure the Deputy Governor will jump in, and quite rightly. There are 5 elements that I'd like to mention, things we're seeing in the reporting we get from companies. But as I've said from the start, there's been significant progress and improvement, and the information has a lot of quality. But there are 5 things I'd like to mention, 5 C's in Spanish, because it all starts with a C. But first of all, perhaps the information could be more quantitative. There's qualitative information, but we also need quantitative information. And I'll give you an example. Companies can say, well, we have committed to comply with human rights regulations, but we need specific data, numbers. Oh, and also, for example, when a company talks about the gender gap in salaries, well, a number's all very well, but you have to explain what methodology you're using, because there are many different methodologies which consider different factors, and so we need a more quantitative approach. And things need to be comparable, and that's something that I believe is one of the most relevant, and we're not quite there yet. And it's true that the private sector, as we've heard from Aitor, from BlackRock, has made a lot of progress, and there's lots of standards and benchmarks, and perhaps just too many acronyms, but there is a certain trend in Spain with to use GRI, but also there's others. And there is a certain standardization, but they're not comprehensive. Even if you use CRI, only 16% of the companies that send us reports use the most comprehensive version. And so we don't yet have an approved common regulatory standard. We're working at the European level and at the international level, but it is one of the things that needs to improve, because if we can't compare, investors don't really have the ability to make the right choices. As I was saying, the data needs to be more quantitative, more comparable, more comprehensive, or more complete, because sometimes you only report the data that make you look good, and that's cherry picking, and that's just not good enough. And then it has to be reliable. You have to be able to trust that information. Companies have their own control mechanisms to make sure the data is reliable and accurate, but there's third-party verification also. Just like in financial reporting, we have auditors who verify and certify the information. In non-financial or sustainability information, we also have third-party verification, and the law in Spain requires that verification, but the different actors are not yet regulated, so we're missing that component. And the final one I want to mention, I'll leave it at that, and to me is one of the most difficult for supervisors, since we are also in charge of investor protection. It has to be comprehensible or understandable. Why? Because we find ourselves in a position where we have many very diverse companies, and the information that has to be disclosed and reported needs to be reported in such a way that it truly reflects the situation of each company. Perhaps companies that currently have no revenue coming from sustainable activities, but who are investing significantly in order to achieve the necessary transformation. And so you need to have sufficiently comprehensive information to reflect that, but at the same time, you cannot overwhelm investors with huge amounts of information. It needs to be simple enough for investors, particularly retail investors, to be able to understand that information and use it. And so there's balance between reflecting everything that's in the ecosystem and promoting this transformation, but at the same time simplifying the information so that investors can compare and use it for decision making is a difficulty that we face every day in the European discussion. Very well. Deputy Governor, we've heard about these 5 requirements. It has to be quantitative, comprehensible, reliable, and understandable, and so on. But how are the companies doing? Because you are also supervisors. So for sustainable finance, how is this looking? Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Beatriz, for the invitation. It's actually been really interesting to listen to everyone, from the Vice President to, of course, Aitor and Beatriz in the previous panel. But let's see. From the banking supervisor point of view, which is what we are, the Bank of Spain has a very broad and diverse mandate, and it all does fall under a sort of umbrella or headline that we could call watching over the financial stability of the country. But under that umbrella, and from the perspective of the banking supervisor, we have, of course, taken a lot of steps in the right direction, I think, but there's still a lot of work to do. And one element which is key is what the President of the CNMV has just mentioned, and that's the data. Because these issues that the CNMV is finding in listed companies, of course, the banking supervisor is also finding in banks, not just in listed banks, but in all banks. And so our main goal is to analyze the risks and to make sure those risks are properly identified, monitored, managed, and so on and so forth. That is, that banks be aware of all of those risks. And our goal is not to try and accelerate or promote policies that haven't yet been defined by governments or even higher level authorities like the European Union. Our goal is to analyze how those risks would impact, first, the economy, the banks, the companies, the sectors, and the people. And here, of course, I'm referring to the whole range of elements and functions that we have in the Bank of Spain, everything from our role advising the government through macroeconomic research, macroprudential, macrofinancial research, economic monetary policies, but of course also supervision and payment system. Let us not forget. And so to do all that, we need data. And we need the data from banks, but also from companies. And here our scope grows exponentially beyond that of listed companies, because we're talking also all the SMEs in this country, which should be able to provide data or some type of energy certificate or energy consultancy so that their carbon footprint can be recorded in the balances of the banks, in the granular data in the bank's books. And that's crucial. And all of that makes up an ecosystem which ultimately resides in the bank's balance sheets, but also partially in the supervisor's databases, because the Bank of Spain has possibly the largest database in the country in the financial field, and that would enable us to analyze the risks for the economy and would allow the banks to analyze the risks that they have already, because they have quite a significant stock in their books, obviously, but which they may also incur in over the next few years, thinking about what we've heard before, which is very significant, medium and the long term. And all of this is very complex, very, very complex. But again, it takes us back to everything the Vice President said, and it's all about the data, the quality of the data, the comparability of the data, being able to make sure that the data are comparable, homogeneous, and of course we're not there yet. Well, both of you, allow me to ask you then, what's missing? What do we need? Is it a lack of will or regulation? Why is that not there yet? Well, what we need actually first and foremost is time, because you can imagine that rebuilding all those databases, at least the ones I'm referring to, with enough granularity, but also for big listed corporates in this country as well, has huge costs, and you can do some approximations through proxies or databases that you construct with other metrics, but it's actually very costly and very difficult to do. Saying that, imagine a simple balance bank sheet contains loans to companies or large corporates and mortgages. Mortgages, on average, are in their balance sheet for 15 to 20 years on average. And in most cases, I want to trust that everything's now digital, but perhaps the data is not stored in a database in the right fields. And so perhaps this example can help you understand the complexity and the magnitude of the challenge that we all face. Anyway, I'll leave it there. No, please go on if you want to. No, I was just saying that, and I was remembering, I mentioned earlier about the requirement for companies with over 250 employees having to report non-financial information. So it's very difficult. It's not just what the deputy governor was saying about how you get data from vendors and suppliers, but it's also very costly and time-consuming for the companies. And if the companies don't have huge resources, because they're not big corporates, to create all those mechanisms and generate all of that reporting is not easy. And excuse me, Javier, just to answer the question about how you get there, if there's enough time, I would like to talk about that, because in fact there has been progress at the European level and internationally in order to develop common standards and to provide a reference framework for companies that I think is key. But of course it takes time. But there has been a lot of work done.
Enseguida. Te voy a preguntar enseguida por el
I'll be asking you about the what and the when, but you know, there's a lack of resources. It's, you know, that's what you were saying. It's a lack of resources, maybe regulation as well. But I wish we could get into the board of directors of a main corporate, a major company. Okay, so Red Eléctrica. In the board, how do you do this? How do you work with, you know, how do you go about CSR, sustainability? How do you live this on a day-by-day basis? Well, thank you very much, Javier. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be part of this panel. Thanks to Chair and to everybody in Red Eléctrica who's made this possible. You know, the authorities, well, I mean, because they are the authorities, okay, yeah, okay, so they speak about data all the time, and this, they are right. I mean, this is a challenge for all boards of directors and for corporates in general. And, you know, I'm here on behalf of the board of directors of Red Eléctrica, but I'm also speaking on behalf of all corporates, because these are indeed major challenges, not only in terms of resources, quantitative resources, yes, but as boards, we are used to comply with our duties to that any information that we provide outside the company that we give out needs to be traceable, reliable, measurable, solid. And now we have an increasing number of requirements in a framework where you don't really have a way or a procedure for reporting, and with an additional requirement on top of that, which is comparability. And this is yet an added stress to the boards, for the boards, because on the basis of that information, we will be benchmarked against others, and this has repercussions everywhere, and for investors as well. And that's the goal, actually. You know, you need data in order to measure companies, and so I try to look beyond this operational challenge. And at the end of the day, what companies, we corporates and businesses are trying to do is to respond to a social challenge. Why? Because companies today, and this is something that's been mentioned earlier in the first part, it's that companies, businesses today, we are not just some providers of some financial profit. We need to be able to convey our vision for the future. We need to pass that on and to convey it to society. So this is a social request and a requirement as well. How the company is going to be sustainable in the future. Society wants to know. They need to know about us, and those who are requiring that information from us, well, they are in turn imposing a number of requirements and duties. It is a major challenge, yes, but we must not lose sight on what we really want to achieve. It's not data themselves. It's to be able to connect those data with the actual business strategy of a company, because we are using these tools. For me, these are guidelines, ways of, of reporting. When we work on sustainability, for instance, and we discuss this financial framework, it's true that we're using operational elements, but the idea is to see what is the future of a company, what we are focusing on, and what's the future we want to embrace. So, and that's the strategy. So that's when this starts making sense for the board of directors. And this is not just one more item in the agenda, it's or a strategy for the future, and how all of those elements are connected to it. And so the board of directors is aware that they need to provide the means and the resources for that, for those instruments, reporting data is not just an instrument, it's also a tool to achieve that future. So we will see that. We will need to see what is coming and when it is coming. So what lies ahead, that's what we need to know. And when. Well, it's a lot is coming. It's lots of reporting requirements, apart from those that we have mentioned, some are in the works, but something that's, I feel it's important for this comparability and this, it's the development of common standards, both at the European and international levels. Because if you have common standards that serve as a basis for all companies to report their information, that gives you a frame of reference. You know what what degree of granularity you have to achieve. So this is sort of a game, or a race rather, that we need to rush. We need to go very fast because time is we're pressed for time. We need to go very fast, and standard setters at international level and European level, they need to act very fast. But we need to reach our goals together. We need to cross the goalposts together. So, because one of the problems that we might end up with otherwise would be to have different standards depending on the jurisdiction, on the geography. So there is the AFRAG, the FRAG is the advisory group that is developing these standards on the European level. It's actually working on the development of a reference framework for sustainable information, sustainable reporting. If everything goes well and according to plan, by the end of the year we will already have a draft, and by the end of next year the European Commission will adopt it, and then in the following year companies and businesses will be able to publish for 2024 what the situation was in 2023. So, time is of the essence here, as I was saying. So, and we must not limit ourselves to Europe. We are speaking about global markets, so comparisons need to be international. So we cannot restrict ourselves to a given territory. So the foundation IFRS, through JOSCO, we are also participating there, and to develop these global standards. That's what we're currently working on. And what's the difficulty? Well, difficulty lies in the fact that not all jurisdictions have the same degree of ambition. Europe, for instance, we are one of the jurisdictions with the highest degrees of ambition, and that you can see that in the financial information requirements and reporting requirements that we have. I don't want to get into a too highly technical terrain, but it's a double materiality of principle, and businesses need to report on how climate impacts on climate and how climate impacts on their activities. So it's not the same requirement everywhere else. So in the IFRS Foundation, they have the same timelines, more or less, than we have in Europe, that they are trying to integrate a different degree of ambition that we have in all jurisdictions. So 2024, it's quite around the corner. I mean, it's not that far away. I remember that it was just a couple of years ago that we started with sustainable development, and it seems like, it was just yesterday. So, and now, so many things have changed since then. So, Deputy Governor, in Spain, situation is the same. Every study, every UN study, other studies, they say that Spain is a particularly exposed country to adverse effects, and that affects the banking sector and other sectors, and some regulators have already integrated those risks when assessing their regulated bodies and from the financial point of view. How are you managing that as the Bank of Spain? Well, there's a key issue here, and that is the stress test analysis. And that's been mentioned earlier before. In September, on the 20th, I believe, a paper by the European Central Bank published this paper based on top-down risk stress test coming from stress tests. It has a number of methodological goals, maybe some shortcomings, yes, but the idea, I think, probably was not to cover everything, every single element, but to have an overview. And Spain was not in a very good position after that. So this is the first paper, I believe, that has been published on this issue. But in a few weeks, the Bank of Spain will also be publishing a stress test exercise on our banking system. We are using a methodology that has been we have designed at in-house. It's our own. It is quite interesting. It will be just appearing in a box. And impacts are not dramatic, but it's true that it's a very long-term horizon for up to 2050 for physical risks, and this entails a very, very high risk in terms of methodology and data. But using several variables, we have reached a number of findings and conclusions that are not dramatic, not for the banking profitability or the or GDP, but it has an impact. It is true, it has an impact. It's not that major, but it has an impact. We have data. I have maybe exaggerated a bit when I said that we are lacking data, but we do have data from the electricity sector, agriculture, transport, automobile, etc. So we do have a certain amount of data, and that's what we've used to reach these findings. So what do we have in the pipeline? Well, there's a stress test, of course, of the whole European banking system that we are doing together with the SSM, the European Central Bank, and national authorities. We are contributing our know-how, our human resources, some of our staff who are experts in performance stress tests. That's our contribution, but no capital will be required. They're not going to require banks to put up a bit more capital if they're more exposed to climate change risks. What we will be doing is some sort of qualitative recommendations. So what's the purpose of these stress tests? Well, first of all, is to see what is the ability of banks to measure their own risk, how they are what's the internalization in their own structure, this sustainability issues, and what data we are missing. Once again, data. And what are those banks' vulnerabilities, and what we can all learn from that, including supervisors, because we are all learning here. We need to be humble, and here we need to eat some humble pie. All of us, we need to learn by doing, and that's very interesting, extremely interesting. But I thought that journalists, we used to be the ones that were spiking or articles or stories, but you have really spiced things up with this information. So this will not be exactly like an official warning, but sort of a wake-up call. Yeah, it's going to be a wake-up call. Get started. Start measuring up your own risks in your own internal management systems. Try to internalize this and try to include that in the price of your operations, because we mentioned profitability, but sustainability needs to be sustainable everywhere, in all senses of the word. So they need to be financially sustainable as well, and pay attention to all these risks that will be having an impact on all of us everywhere in the economy. This will be a major exercise. It will start in 2022, still a bit of time. It will be published in the summer, around July 2022. So next year, we will be, and the following year, we will have the results, you know, and the headlines of all newspapers. Yes, if there are no leaks before that. Okay, Beatriz Corredor is going to kill me, actually kill me if I don't speed things up. But we are currently, you know, discussing and seeing lots of new elements in terms of regulation. But let's see things from both sides, you know, inside and outside the company, looking in from the outside, looking in, and vice versa. So what does this mean in practical terms from watching this and seeing this from the inside, from the company's perspective? Well, I think that what you see in the board need to be the result of you know, of a conviction in, you know, being really convinced in the board. You know, you've mentioned greenwashing, but here you need to be really it's like awareness washing. I mean, you really need to be aware of issues. In Red Eléctrica, a sustainability committee was created, and it was not created because we had to. It was already in 2018. It was a result of, it was a decision of the board. And if there's no conviction, if people are not convinced to do things, the board won't decide anything they're not convinced about. And that's the good thing about the board, as the chair was saying. This is a part of our DNA. That's sustainability is part of the DNA, and this is why we have this will to deal with it. We've always had it. I think that this committee, I used to be chairing that committee. Now I'm no longer chairing it, but I'm sure that this committee needs to be a cross-cutting committee. It cannot be isolated from the rest. To me, it needs to be a support and auxiliary committee to everybody else in the company. It needs to ensure that the framework for any decisions taken by the board, you know, any investment, any risk map, anything, you know, purchasing, buying a company, or any decisions that are made in the board need to go through this commitment. I mean, needs to be consistent. They need to be consistent with this commitment towards sustainability. And what we need to do is to support everybody along the way. For instance, just a couple of examples, and you know, any board in, you know, financing framework. A green financing framework needs to follow a number of financial policies that have been decided by other for you know, deciding the priorities for financing that need to be aligned with our strategy plan. But how we are going to have a framework, how we are going to create a framework that allows for that those financing needs to be covered in the strategy plan, etc. Well, the Sustainability Committee is always working on the next strategy plan. That's on the basis of the next strategy plan, the one that has not yet been adopted, so not on the current one, but on the future one. And then, so for instance, you need to align remunerations committee, for instance, how we will not, for instance, KPIs and all of our sustainability committee needs to be reflected in the goals, in the KPIs that the Committee on Appointments and Remuneration is fixing. So people working on sustainability, well, they try to be the driving force for the organization in sustainability terms, but in the board, everybody who's working closely with sustainability they need to try and have this as a horizontal culture. Every single decision made by the board need to be absolutely consistent with that committee. Now that nobody's listening to us and we are, this just the two of us, but is this taken, just in stride, or is this considered as a burden? Well, I think it is. We take this in stride because I remember. I know that when you sit down and see the number of reports that you need to produce or to generate in 1 year, well, just one more, you say, okay, just one more. But then you see what the results are, the information you obtain, and what challenges you can identify, and opportunities that you can also identify. So if you can actually make the most of that wealth of information that you are producing, then it's always beneficial. So you learn by reporting. So you learn more things, new things. So we will be, it's something, it's reporting is always good, as we reporters say. Okay, if, the deadlines are the worst part. If we had all of the resources available, that would be, just the perfect world. But if you don't measure, you cannot know something. You don't actually know what you cannot measure, and that's also always true. So we have 130 funds that are promoting sustainability that come from the March regulation, CNMV, and then regulation for the dissemination of information and disclosure. So what is the recommendation of the regulator here? I mean, I'd like to hear that. Before saying anything, I'd like to admit here that the investment funds and investment services sector, well, they've had a rough time, yeah. And we need to actually recognize the work they've been doing and to actually provide so much reporting, because this regulation that came into force in March laid down a number of obligations and requirements for investment funds. And we need to admit that as well, many legislative requirements were not yet implemented. You don't have the details on how to comply, but you need to comply. And we at the CNMV, we have published Q&As, FAQs, guidelines, and to try and facilitate and make it easier for them how to update the information. And they provided it is a major piece of work that they have had to do, how they publish the sustainability figures and the regular information, periodic information. They need to report whether they belong to Article 8 or Article 9 funds, but as a whole, let's say that the work that they have been doing has been extraordinary. They will need to do much more. There are more reporting requirements coming in the next few months, and we will also be there for listed companies, listed corporates, so to try and make it a bit easier for them to comply. But we can see we are witnessing how the number of funds is increasing, the number of funds that are providing that information. But we have already 147 funds in Spain that can be considered as sustainable funds, then 141 that are promoting sustainability, and 6 with the specific goal of sustainability. So this means it's virtually 16% of the whole investment funds capital there, assets and management. So we can see how this large wealth of savings from investors can be channeled to through instruments that allow us to change our economy. If we cannot channel all that information, that change that is so necessary, we won't be able to make it happen. So we have 2-3 minutes, even though we'll try and make the most of what we have. So I'd like to ask both of you, with this, with the outlook for the next few months, Bank of Spain, this is going far too slow. Climate change impact is unstoppable, and apparently it's speeding up, it's accelerating. So what is your perspective on all that? As I said, we are currently preparing and going to be publish the stress test. Okay, give us the, I mean, you baited us, so just give us the spoiler now. Okay, there are very few institutions on a European level that, so as I'm also a European supervisor, so I'll speak from that viewpoint. There are very few European banks that are prepared to face those risks and to include them in the management, not only in the board perspective, but so that this trickles down to the rest of the organizations. There are many elements here that need to be taken into account. It's part of the risk culture, the top-down culture, the committees and commissions, that needs to start at the top, but this needs to be trickling down to the risks committee. First line of defense is business, and then second line is risks, and third line of defense is audits. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think this will be a part of the outcome of that stress test that we will be conducting next year. There are very, very few banks that have already reached the first line. We expect large banking corporations to be better prepared. Well, it's because of our female intuition, but we all, I mean, I say this off the top of my head, but we also have some data to back this up. But smaller banks will be worse off, worse prepared, but that's only natural given the major challenges that we've had to face, and as we discussed earlier. So from the stock exchange perspective, from financial perspective regulation, you've done some changes. In 2017, you changed the governance model. So what's the first your first lessons learned, and what are the outcome? Is the outlook for the future? Well, the perspectives already in 2018, we started to implement the international recommendations from the task force, but I'd like to say something that it's somewhat linked to what we discussed earlier, trying to get ahead of things, to do things in advance. In 2012, we already did a first take of this. We modified many things in 2018, but we anticipated a bit the future. Even though you don't have all the details yet, or even if you don't have the exit methodology to begin with, but to start early, to be an early bird is always very positive. It is a challenge. You need to have the government component very well implemented, because integrating climate risks is not only something that needs to be present at the board of governors, it needs to be everywhere in the company. So the model is really top down. But when we speak about climate risks, we need to compare with identification, assessment of risks, and quantification of risks. It's more or less the same approach, but with certain differences. We are used to identify risks that are very close to the business, some wider risks, broader risks have been included in the last few years, but always with quite a close perspective. We spoke about 4-7 years time, but now climate risks, one of the most the hardest things for a board is that the time factor is completely different. It's a differentiating factor. It's a differential factor. So you need to be integrating risks with an outlook to 4-7 years, but now here you need to look beyond. So we're speaking about 2050, 2070. So our risk measurement has starts there. So will be will our forecasts be right? Probably not. There will be many intervening factors in between in the meantime, but still we have this risk measurement strategy, this way of doing things, this methodology that will need to be changed, of course, but anticipating risk is something that will need, it's a living thing, it's subject to change, but the mindset and the means that the company is putting in place to try to achieve that perspective, this long-term perspective, is very, very positive. We need to speak about data and risks, but that's true. But also opportunities. I really want to insist on that. They are two faces of the same coin. When you assess risks, there are very diverse scenarios, things that do not exist today, but they're also generating a lot of opportunities for companies to try to anticipate, to forecast, and try to plan ahead for the two sides to face the sides of the coin is the right attitude, and that's the mindset that needs to prevail in the board. And we are the ones that need to be actually driving the driving force behind the top management. So they need to not only to comply with their usual obligations, but also things in the very long in the future, in 2070, for instance, sometimes. So that's sometimes hard, but anything that we will be doing will be also helpful for us to be doing things later. So I'd like to thank you. Thanks to the three of you for your clarity, for your honesty, and for your patience with the members of the press, which is highly appreciated. And thirdly, thank you for all the interesting things that you said. A big round of applause for the three of you. So thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias a las hemos hablado de voluntad.
So we've spoken about will, and we've spoken about the battle for funds and funding. And again, we've talked about businesses, we talked about regulation, and about which institutions and regulations will emerge based on this will and on this legal framework. And of course, now we need to talk about a rather unimportant detail, which is the money. How are we going to fund all this? Let's talk about funding and about how all this green investment is to be financed and everything that is to come. So let's talk literally about challenges for the green reconstruction and how to finance it.
En esta cuestión de hablar de...
And speaking of money and money to fund the green economy, of course, it means talking about sustainability, well, about how to fund sustainability in general, not just the green economy, is to talk about a lot of money. In fact, so much money that the European Commission, as you know, in 2019 approved the European Green Deal, and now the funds are beginning to arrive. The next gen funds, that's 750 billion euros, but there's also an additional 1.2 trillion euro budget from the Commission. We have the next gen funds, 140 billion more for Spain specifically, 40% of them targeting the green transformation, decarbonization, energy efficiency. And so clearly we're not talking about small amounts of money, we're talking about huge amounts of money. And so let's talk about all of this. And I'm going to introduce our speakers in this fourth and last panel today. José Carlos García de Quevedo, who's the chairman of the ICO, the Official Credit Institute, Roberto García, who's the CEO of Red Eléctrica, and Roberto Fernández, who's a member of the Platform for Sustainable Finance of the European Commission. And in the program, we had Birte Brun-León, who's with the European Investment Bank, and she is the Director for Operations here in Iberia, and she's attending remotely. Hello, how are you? Hello, good afternoon. Just to check that we can hear you and that you can hear us and that everything's working. Okay, so I'd like to begin by asking the panelists and the ICO specifically, because as I've said, we're talking about a lot of money. But really, this is your business. This is precisely your field, and this is what has just been literally tested just 2 weeks ago under COVID. And now, of course, the prospect of all of this money, and there are voices that speak about such a flood of money that there won't be a way to absorb it. But my first question for the ICO is precisely this. And now what? And how is it going to be managed? How will the transformation happen? How will you approach all of this? Well, good evening, and thank you to Red Eléctrica for organizing this very timely meeting on sustainability and how to finance it, which is the topic for this panel. During the pandemic, as well as the COVID guarantee lines for companies and the self-employed and SMEs, we worked very hard to prepare the ICO to deal with the challenges that would arise in sustainability and digitalization. In fact, the ICO board approved its first sustainability policy, which is a very ambitious and far-reaching policy, so that we can respond to these challenges. Also, we prepared during 2020 and 2021 in order to be certified by the European Commission, in order to become implementing partner for successive programs, so that we could manage, in partnership with the ministries, the EU Next Gen funds and the multi-annual funding framework with different programs and facilities, which are actually going to be replaced by new financial facilities in the new framework. But anyway, our frame of reference is defined by the government's Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan, and all of those investments, 40% of which, as you've said, will be targeting sustainability so that we can contribute through a public-private partnership, because that is a basic principle that cannot be done by the EU alone or the ministries. It has to be done in partnership with the private sector and with the markets. And we need to carry out this transition being realistic, but also ambitious, and taking advantage of all opportunities that develop. And also the other frame of reference is the multi-annual funding framework of the EU. And I'm very happy that the Commission, that the platform is represented here, and the European Investment Bank, which of course is our counterpart with whom we cooperate a great deal in all of these matters. We have been defining 3 strategic priorities: business growth, sustainability, and digitalization. And we've been doing that in a horizontal way, because sustainability permeates everything. It's pluridimensional, and it has to do with the deposit side of the banking business. We've issued sustainable, social and green bonds, because sustainability is multidimensional, for an amount of 5.5 billion euros, which mobilized about 15 billion euros from the private sector. The success of the implementation is the pipeline of projects that we are developing. And on the asset side of the business, we are incorporating loans linked to sustainability indicators. We're funding new types, including acquiring bonds of sustainable projects. Last year, we had about 2.7 billion sustainable activity, which is about 40% of our activity now. And that is the trend that we would like to continue from year to year during the next multi-annual framework. And in the previous panel sessions, they talked a lot about governance. So, of course, it's important to have the metrics, the EU's taxonomy, being able to compare over time and also with other actors, with other banks. And not too long ago, in the COP25, which took place in Madrid, the Spanish financial sector signed a joint commitment to fight climate change. And there are resources. Of course, the issue is to mobilize those resources and to achieve the transformation we need. And for the ICO, which finances companies and SMEs, although we can also get involved in other projects, energy efficiency projects with individuals and homeowners, we can mobilize and accelerate this transformation process over time and as quickly as possible so that we can implement and execute this huge amount of resources that are on the table, and again through public-private partnerships always. At Red Eléctrica, we've been told that your vision leads to 2050 and 2070, no less. And I apologize for this question, which may seem a bit naive, but how can you plan financially for 2050 or 2070? What does that mean? Well, it's, I think, all about the same thing, which is always to be focused on sustainability. To think of a project like ours, which are going to have a life cycle of over 40 years, knowing that you have to provide sustainable finance for those projects, as well as sustainable implementation and activity, and all of that means you have to have a long-term vision, which is Red Eléctrica's philosophy. Earlier we said that Red Eléctrica's DNA is probably sustainability, but it's a requirement. We are an infrastructure administrator, and that means being very much focused on the long term and being all about sustainable management. And that's why we're used to moving within these kinds of timelines, 2050, 2070, because that's the nature of our business. And I think that the company has been working within that approach and with that sustainability philosophy together with a very long-term perspective. So we're very comfortable actually working with these long-term timelines and focused on sustainability, because that's really the essence of our business. But forgetting about your profit margins, for example, to reach the Paris Agreement targets, does that mean giving up on your margins? And does it mean saying, well, I'll have losses this year, or my margins are going to shrink by 1.2 points? No, I believe, my personal opinion is that it's actually the opposite. I think complying with sustainability targets actually creates tangible value for a company, impacts its P&L positively. It means greater stability in the company's shareholding. And I think in Red Eléctrica we have very clear examples of the fact that our management philosophy focused on sustainability has created value and is creating value for the company. And I'll give you an example, if I may. Just 3 years ago, in 2018, 25–30% of our shareholders of our shareholding was one socially responsible investment. In that 3 years, that figure has increased by 50%. Currently, over 45% of Red Eléctrica shareholders are socially responsible investors. And that is value for the company, and that's tangible. And also, those sustainable finance criteria also have a direct impact on lower funding costs, and that's also tangible value for the company, because you can get capital more cheaply. Exactly. There are two very clear examples. In 2017, Red Eléctrica started to change its funding criteria from traditional funding to ESG funding. These were criteria and targets that were met, and our cost of funding decreased. And an obvious example was the issuance of our second green bond in May this year, where the spread was the lowest ever in Spain of the last decade. And that because it was sustainable long-term finance linked to a green bond, to a sustainable activity. Well, we have Britta and we have Roberto here, and both of them, of course, with the perspective of an international institution or platform. But again, Britta, for you who are further away, and of course it will be a bit more difficult, do jump in at any time. This is an open discussion. But I'm going to ask you something specifically. At the European Investment Bank, what is your role in all of this? What mechanisms do you have for this? And again, of course, here the question is not whether there's going to be enough money, because it seems that there's plenty of money. But the question is whether we're going to have enough mechanisms to absorb that money and whether we're going to be able to use it for its purpose, 40% green investment. What's your plans and your forecasts? Well, thank you very much. I do want to thank Red Eléctrica for inviting me to take part in this panel and for allowing me to participate remotely. What can the role of the European Investment Bank be? Well, as the financial arm of the European Union, we've always had and continue to have a very clear aim, which is to contribute to sustainable, inclusive growth by funding investments that have a positive impact on the economy and society. And I could also add that sustainability, like Red Eléctrica, is also part of our DNA and has been from the start. And in that sense, the role of the European Investment Bank in this most recent crisis has taken two forms which are interconnected, although separate. One of them is, or was, to react immediately, urgently, for the short term, in order to respond to the needs, urgent needs that developed during the crisis in terms of lack of liquidity and access to funding. And the second, which has a longer term horizon, which has to do with the more structural investment and funding needs. The bank's immediate actions included mostly the adoption in March and April last year of an immediate action package for COVID-19, which included essentially three elements. The first was to quickly facilitate access to funding for SMEs through new funding and guarantee programs. And I should also mention a large line which we established together with the ICO. And the second element was to extend existing lines of credit that had been approved in previous years to make sure that investments that had been planned would not have to be stopped due to the crisis, and so that they would have enough funding to continue implementation. And thirdly, we made a significant effort to approve new deals, particularly for the hardest hit sectors in the pandemic, including the healthcare sector and transportation. And I'm happy to say that Spain was, and it still is, unfortunately, one of the hardest hit countries due to the pandemic, but it has also been one of the greatest beneficiaries of COVID funding from the European Investment Bank, with almost 10 billion disbursed up to now. And continuing with the emergency actions, we also launched the European Guarantee Fund, or EGF, which is an instrument that operates on the basis of contributions from the member states for almost 25 billion, and which is used as guarantees to provide new funding transactions. This fund is still underway, and its goal is to mobilize additional funding for about 200 billion euros. And longer term, our activities focused on more structural investment have to do with funding investments that can improve the growth potential of the different economies, particularly focusing on the green plans and decarbonization strategies, which are two of the key elements of the recovery and resilience plans. And there I can say that I think that the European Investment Bank can contribute a great deal because of its expertise, as well as its ability to mobilize and catalyze large volumes of funding, we usually fund up to 50%, in some cases also more, of the funding volumes needed. And that, of course, gives key guarantees so that investments can take place. In the last years, the bank has made a significant effort to decarbonize European economies by including climate as an integrated element in our funding, from the more obvious sectors such as energy to industry, housing, and transportation. And we have also increased from 2016 significantly our funding for research and development and digitalization. And a key vehicle to do that was the Strategic Investment Plan, or the Juncker Plan, as it was known, where Spain has also been one of the main beneficiaries. This model is based on using budgetary funds, union budget funds, as a guarantee for first losses. And here we've been able to extend our funding to new counterparties and to high-risk projects, as well as other schemes. And it's a model which has been a real change of paradigm with the use of European funds, because it has enabled, through its own design, to multiply the impact on the economy, activity, employment, and that is a model that we think can also serve as a model for future instruments, including the next-gen funds, in order to achieve a multiplier effect. Well, let us now hear from our other panelists, because of course we have the platform, the European Union. I said earlier, 2019, the Green Deal, and I said that all of this happened before COVID. There were certain plans and there was certain funding, and did that stop, and what's to happen now, and what do you think will be the role, because we're thinking about the role of all these institutions, but what will be the role of the European Commission? Well, thank you to Red Eléctrica for inviting us. I think it's a wonderful event, and I do want to congratulate the organizing team. And I'll just clarify that I actually work with SDRG and sustainability in Iberdrola, and I have the honor of representing the company and Spain in the Commission's platform. And I'm proud to be there, and it's an opportunity to see Brussels very clearly with all its pros and cons, and how a very democratic process to produce regulation and legislation works in practice. And so the European Commission, of course, is the government of the European Union. And like any government, it has 4 significant roles. First, of course, to define the strategy and the priorities. Second, to develop all the legislation that needs to follow those policies. Thirdly, to provide resources. And fourth, supervision. And I think, starting with the strategy, I think the communication of Fit for 55 was particularly relevant, and that's quite recent. And it sets a very clear aim for Europe. We want to be a decarbonized economy by 2050, whilst respecting biodiversity and without leaving anyone behind. So respecting the European social agenda. So basically there are some halfway targets, which is to reduce emissions by 55% from 1990 by 2025, and they start with legislative developments. That's the second part. And this new legislation covers aspects that go from the additional investments needed for renewable energy, electric mobility, land uses, forestry, electrification of industrial processes, electrification of heating. All of this will mean significant legislation, and that's going to be the Commission's responsibility too. They're going to reform the emissions rights system, which currently covers large industry, but they'll also be including air transport and road transport, and that will mean that filling your tank with oil will be more expensive. Why? Because they want to promote the use of electric vehicles, for example. And another key element of the legislation to protect European industry and our competitiveness is a border mechanism to adjust the footprint to imports, because Europe cannot be the clean continent while we import products with huge carbon footprints, and that's a geostrategic element that I'd like to see deployed. It'll be interesting to see how we manage it, but it is one of the aims of the Commission, which also defends this emission rights mechanism as something that has worked, reducing emissions by 24% whilst the GDP went up 60%. So it's a mechanism which has worked. And then, of course, there's the funding, and that's next gen, and that's 700 and 800 billion for green recovery, as the President of the Commission told us, 11 billion for social fund for fair transition to mitigate or offset the impacts. But on Fit for 55, the social aspects of the Commission are covered with an additional fund of some 70 billion euros that will come from those emission rights that are sold. So it's true that the product's going to get more expensive, but then that money is going to go to offset potential negative impacts on communities and sectors. And finally, the last point is supervision. The Commission will provide a huge quantity of money to the member states with very clear conditions, and what we have to do together is to get the projects right. And we, as a company within the sector, the energy sector, we like the German model. We're looking at different ideas, but we think that we need to look for large-scale, disruptive projects that will transform the economy, which will cause disruptive innovation executed by companies with experience in managing large projects, but which will also attract other SMEs, because of course we don't do things alone, and so we will create more wealth and a more local impact. And getting it right with these types of projects will probably be the key to the success of this huge volume of investment, but we have to make sure that it will be effective and truly change things. Green hydrogen, large networks for transport and distribution, recharging stations for electric vehicles, renewable energies, PV, of course, energy efficiency. There's a whole range of things. Well, of course, first dilemma in all of this is that all of this Fit for 55 will mean some products will get more expensive, certainly, as we're already seeing. And you've spoken about air transport, but many other things which obviously will get more expensive. But can we afford this? But of course, the alternative is, can we afford not to do it? And that's really our dilemma. And well, actually, since this is a panel, let me jump in and interrupt. Some years ago, we all had traditional light bulbs at home, and when you went to buy an efficient light bulb, it was really expensive, and LED lights were even more expensive. But then they banned traditional light bulbs, and LED lights are now super cheap, and we're all saving a tremendous amount of energy. And we could share innumerable examples like that, where regulations become an opportunity for improvement and a quality of life standard that we all take on board. Yes, and in terms of funding, and I'm sorry to look at all of you, but also the ICO, for the funding, because you've been saying that this is the money that's available, and the European Investment Bank has deployed a full range of instruments, as has the European Commission, but do we have the capabilities? Do we have enough projects? And do we have the expertise and the structures we need to invest this money wisely? Because of course you're all saying that if this is a success, will it be a success? Or is there a risk that it might be wasted money? No, we don't have that risk. We will succeed, again, through public-private partnerships. So here, companies are key, and some of the concepts you mentioned are crucial. For example, large corporates and their multiplier effect over SMEs. We, with some companies present here, are already working to define sustainability projects that will be deployed throughout the whole country. And with that, with Connecting Europe facility, we will be able to subsidize, these are subsidies, they don't have to be repaid. We will fund these initiatives and get a subsidy from the Commission for between 10, 12% and 20% maximum. And that will have a multiplier effect. We will finance recharging stations for electric vehicles throughout the country and throughout the Iberian Peninsula with those European funds. Also PV plants, retrofitting the book, which is to replace the most polluting engines with, and furnaces with gas, as well as urban transport projects with green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, for example. So Spain, I think, is one of the most active players right now in terms of projects, together with the European Investment Bank, which is supporting us to attract these types of projects. But what we would like is to see that multiplier effect, to have more projects that are in the pipeline, and the ministries are working on the specific sector plans of all types, because this is not just about the electrical sector. It's for industry, it's for SMEs, it's for the circular economy, which is a special priority for the ICO. In fact, with the European Investment Bank, we're participating in two initiatives that are both very interesting for Spain. The joint initiative for the circular economy, where we are participating together with other European counterparts to promote the circular economy in the European Union, and then another initiative which has a huge impact on seas, which is the Clean Ocean Initiative, in order to focus on funding by ICO, specifically projects that will take place in Spain or in third countries, promoting investments that will improve the sustainability. And we're speaking about the environment, but I'd like to emphasize the fact that sustainability also has that social dimension, which is very relevant. And the ICO is particularly focused on that, on territorial cohesion, creating quality and stable employment, as well as some other parameters that we're incorporating in our analysis. And that's what we do as a bank, but as a private equity fund, we are also working, for example, with our subsidiary, which has 4 funds, and sustainability is a requirement, together with digitalization for all 4 funds. But we're focusing the infrastructure fund by adding ESG criteria, and we're committed from the moment that, well, for next year, that 50% of all we will do with that fund will be green investments, basically.
No voy a meter en lío a las instituciones internacionales.
So I'll be asking this to you. I won't be trying to trap any of the national institutions, but this is because it's going to give us access to a cheaper capital. It's true that green capital is substantially cheaper. Is there a bubble? Can we speak about green capital bubble? Or as BlackRock said, this is not enough yet. Of course, there is a large demand, enough demand. We've issued green bonds always very successfully, and we have made capital cheaper. So we invested 5 billion and we mobilized 15 billion. So there are projects, and these are investment projects that last for several years, and for companies that are requesting funding or financing for green activities or projects, then we will make them cheaper for you. Capital will be cheaper for them. But I fully agree with your views. In our experience, when we had to have resource to green funding, there were many possibilities. There is a growing demand. I think the taxonomy for sustainable investment in Europe is always also going to be very helpful to make progress, to have a greater comparability, and to have also a greater interest and to drive the interests of foreign investors. Funds are there, and funding is there, and I don't think there's a bubble. I think there's a need and a greater interest in sustainability everywhere. So I'll be asking you about what's to come, but I have here the European Commission wearing 2 hats. So I don't know whether you want to say something about this. You have a green bond issuance, it's quite spectacular, breathtaking. Yeah, I think that we are the largest corporate issuer of green bonds in the world. I mean, of course, as institutional bodies, the public bodies, it's the EIB. But I think there is a much greater demand than there is supply. And now with the taxonomy, given further definitions of what is sustainable capital, will give greater autonomy to businesses, and funds will be reassured that whatever they are buying, it is fully supported. So what this is our figures, but what is, in terms of quality, so what are the instruments that will be next from you, from the EIB? Well, going back to what you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of funding, lots of interest, but there are also many projects. And we, as a bank, we are not creating projects. We are just responding to the demand, the funding demand that is generated by those who are promoting the projects. But there is a very large movement towards decarbonization and sustainability in very many sectors. Our role here is to adapt, constantly adapt to the changing needs in the economy, to try and give the best possible answer to that, and to respond to the needs and demands of the markets and society in general with regard to sustainability in the broader sense of the world, regarding the not only daily life but also in general, in terms of general strategy. This is a need and also a will or ambition. In 2017, we were the pioneers in issuing green bonds, and we have some 34 billion that in accumulated terms. So I think that there are always new things. They have innovation has accelerated with much better design strategy to become the European Bank of Climate. And one of the latest additions in 2019, the board implemented a new policy called energy lending policy in the energy sector that embarked us on along the way of decarbonization in our activity, for both for lending and for the amount that we lent, and the criteria to be applied. One of the main elements was not to oh, sorry, my lights went off. Sorry. But no, you're not in Spain. That would never happen in Spain. Lights will never go off. I mean, a blackout, no, not possible here in Spain. No, not with Red Eléctrica at the helm, no. Well, it's energy savings, you could call it that. Okay, but we can hear you perfectly well, if there's any consolation. Well, okay. Well, maybe I have to move so the sensor can tell I'm here. Okay, so we adopted the decision to stop funding projects with fossil fuels unless it is related to projects with a low carbon content gas, such as the green hydrogen. So in 2019, we also designed two more ambitious goals in the climate agenda. So up to 2025, we want up to 50% of our activities to be represented, constituted by loans in the realm of climate and environment. And we also have the goal to mobilize investment for up to €1 billion, €1 trillion in the most critical period now for decarbonization. So those decisions laid the foundations for a roadmap, the bank's roadmap, the roadmap for the climate bank or the bank. So we have defined the framework for action, and that brought about a change in the definition of criteria for investments that could be financed by the bank. They need to be aligned with the Paris Agreement criteria. It also includes the taxonomy criteria to ensure full alignment with those. And lastly, we have started including in the analysis for projects the climate risks assessment transformation and physical risks, among others, that can be both of the promoters or the investments be facing. But that's not the end of the road. As recently as last week, our board of directors also adopted a new guidance, new guidelines. Not only our investments need to be sustainable or green, but also we also want to ensure that our counterparts, the project promoters, also have very clearly down the road of decarbonization in their goals. In the same meeting, also we adopted a plan not only to mitigate but also for adaptation to the adverse effects of climate change. And we've always, on top of that, tried to modernize and update our portfolio of products so we can help financing in the best possible way. So, as Beatriz said earlier, well, if the larger the possible markets, the larger the action, the broader the action of the EIB must be. Okay, so these are possibilities. Well, while you try and turn on the lights again, turn back the lights, now that the EIB is back on, the lights there are back on, let's discuss the other side of the matter, the risks. So, the European Commission, what are the risks for sustainable recovery, for sustaining that investment? Okay, now here I need to wear the hat. The cap of a utility company. Well, both of them are compatible, of course. I mean, this is why I'm representing both here. So, okay, if you want to mobilize a massive amount of money, because managers, we are managing money that is not ours, it's money that comes from our shareholders or bondholders, and that needs, you need to have a stability, fiscal stability, financial stability, so you can have a reasonable planning with reasonable returns. So I think that's the greatest risk here, that and the geopolitical risk in certain European areas where there might be social instability after COVID and so on. Because even if a bond or a loan are very green, if the business activity behind that is suffering from instability, well, the business is not sustainable. And so now we need to have operational businesses, and that can be sustainable. Is that happening already? Is what you're referring to, is that actually a current reality, or is that a possibility? No, it's a reality. When there is instability, then your investors can tell you, well, you're no longer, you're not investment grade. And has that happened? That happens every time. It has happened, and it still happens. So that thing happens. Yes, that's something that happens. The investors can tell you that you are not investment grade. And now, wearing my European cap, I think we have an example of very good regulation here. We are clearly aware of the stress on supply chains everywhere. Demand has risen after COVID. In China, they started burning more gas and using more coal, and the electricity prices have gone up everywhere. So member states have talked to the Commission, and the Commission has issued a regulation that's an example of good regulation. In my view, we need to maintain marginal markets, that we need to use the funds that are there to offset undesirable impacts on vulnerable elements, and let's promote the long-term energy market so clients can have fixed prices. We need to promote NTS. It's a package called a toolbox. And I think it's a clear example of good regulation. They are fully aware that stability is the first success factor, the first key to success. So you were the head of the European Union, so you have been spared some of the most difficult questions. And that blue helmet that you're wearing today, okay, I'll buy you a coffee later on, because I have 1,000 more questions, but we only have a few minutes ahead of us, just 5 minutes, and my commitment was to be compliant, and we will be compliant and mindful of time. So the last round of questions, ICO. So as a conclusion, planned for the future, what's the outlook, what's the role do you plan to play in the future? So trying to promote this sustainable model as a growth and development model. Future is the transformation of the Spanish business fabric towards a more sustainable model that allows for growth and to be more competitive, and that is through digitalization. We have the European funds for that, and this implementation exercise needs to be seen as a co-responsibility, shared responsibility, both through PPPs, so both the European, and also shared responsibility between the European community, European Union rather, and the member states, and also public sector, private sector, and within the private sector, it's the bank. It's with ICO. We are a bank as well, same as the EIB, and all the different sectors in the financial sectors, services, for instance, and and we cannot leave anyone behind, and that's what our mission is going to be. So so you have, and in your case, you have all the. All your funding is already earmarked for the next few years. Yes, we have a major challenge ahead of us. We have an energy transition where we need to be the promoters, not only from the energy side, but as from a public body as well, public institution. We also need to make the most of our communications and to try and bridge that digital divide that has been so problematic in many parts of the country. As a group, as Red Eléctrica, we need to make use of all the available possibilities. So both these energy shortcomings or communication shortcomings can be overcome. 100% sustainable funding, that's our goal, and it is achievable. So that step, that progress we've made for alignment with the European taxonomy has given us a great advantage. We have large cooperation investment entities that can help us, and major infrastructures that can also help us in that transition. And of course, we do have a major challenge ahead of us, but we also have many things that we can contribute to solve it. Well, outlook, only 3 minutes, and a bit. Okay, it's not only that you have 3 minutes ahead of us, but you could have your lights turned off again. So, so what is the role of implementation of these instruments in the future? The access, very briefly, of the Spanish Recovery and Resilience Plan facility is fully aligned in the Spanish plan with the objectives of the bank and climate, innovation, cohesion. And based on our experience in designing instruments that leverage out all the national resources, we have approved and have reached an agreement already with Greece to manage 5 billion of their funds, available funds under the recovery plan, and to complement it with advising services, consulting services when necessary, as well as providing or offering or co-financing that is designed for projects of high impact projects in key sectors such as tourism, urban development, etc. We have also adopted, and it's currently being negotiated, a similar agreement, although it is completely different in nature, with Italy. We also think that it is a good model that we want to follow and offer to the authorities in other member states. The Spanish Recovery and Resilience Plan also contemplates the EIB as a relevant actor, relevant player, and we have the program Invest EU that has already been mentioned, and we are also preparing for its implementation across the strategic axis. And this is complemented with our own funds activity, with our own resources, in order to improve and accelerate transformation and decarbonization of the economy as a whole. Well, Roberto, just some last words. This is the fair recovery, and nobody needs to be, nobody can be left behind. Avoiding greenwashing. How can you avoid that risk? The key to avoid and prevent greenwashing is full transparency in our operations. The financial accountability and reporting has been discussed very widely this afternoon. It is key. And as for the transition, the chair of Red Eléctrica has just said that it is essential to face and to tackle challenges, not only from the technical side, but also from the social side. We have closed down 17 coal plants in the last few years, and we have not laid off a single employee in the area of Seville. We have shut down our last two coal-fired plants, and the employees, Iberdrola employees, are now have now been reallocated to a project with the University of Seville and the University of the Basque Country. It's a project that is based on the dialogues with the community, try to generate ideas for job generation, job creation. It is a platform that it's quite unique, quite innovative, and so you need to do something. There are always some things that you need to do, even when you shut down one of your plants, and that's transparency, speaking with the community. That's the key. Well, I'd like to thank the four of you for being with us this afternoon, evening. José Carlos García de Quevedo, ICO, José Carlos García de Quevedo, Red Eléctrica, Brite Porteleón, the director for the Iberia operation in the EIB, and Roberto Fernandez, holding two hats today, and member for the platform for sustainable financing. Thank you to the four of you. A big round of applause for the four of you. Thank you. And I'd like to just make a couple of things to wrap up. What's essential now is that this event also has the certificate. It's been certified as a sustainable, green and sustainable event. So we have this label. So we are sustainable as well. And then punctuality. Why? Why is it important to be so punctual on time? Well, because there is a cocktail waiting for you outside. You can ask all our speakers anything that is that you have in mind, and we will be enjoying your company later on. Thank you very much.